Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and this radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. And I'm very, very pleased to have with me today or this evening Maura Maura Meeks, I'm sorry, Maura Meeks,
Cheeks.
whose debut novel, Acts of Forgiveness, is so timely right now. And as we talk about reparations and what's that's going to mean for our community. So welcome, Maura.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we'll be talking a little bit about the book, but first, just a little bit of information about Maura Cheeks. She is the author, as I said, of Acts of Forgiveness, a novel. She was named one of 10 writers to watch by Publishers Weekly. She is a journalist, first and foremost, and has written a number of articles in Paris Review, the New York Times, The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review. That's just a few samplings of what she's been doing over these years. And she is also, more recently, the owner and general manager of a bookstore, Liz's Book Bar. And I hope that we can hear a little bit more about what motivated you to do that. So again, welcome, Maura.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with Acts of Forgiveness, a novel. As I said, it really is very timely because it reimagines what this country would be like and how people would respond, Blacks and whites of all people of all races, if reparations were enacted nationally. What motivated you to write this novel? And I always think that writers want to answer questions. What questions did you have?
Well, I had finished working on an article for The Atlantic about the racial wealth gap, and I guess I continue to have questions after finishing the article about why the country has never seriously pursued a reparations program. And the book, Acts of Forgiveness, is an attempt at answering that question and exploring the realities of what it might be like if we did pursue a reparations program at the federal level.
Okay. So when you were doing your research for this book, did you look at other forms of reparations? For example, what happened with Native Americans? What happened with the Japanese? I mean, what is the kind of research that you did to come up with this? And then also how reparations is being viewed and promoted in other parts of the African diaspora.
Yeah, so I did some research into the Civil Liberties Act, into previous reparations programs. Um, I wrote the draft all the way through and then went back and did more research, just to get the story out. And I didn't want to be sort of influenced by these previous or different programs necessarily, because I think a reparations program for Black Americans would have to be very different from these other acts that have passed. But all that to say, I wrote it all the way through, knowing that there were pockets of research that I needed to go back and do. And so that's what I did. Primarily, I researched, the Civil Liberties Act, a bunch of local reparations movements that are taking place, and looked at, movements in the country to try and move the conversation forward. I think, that influenced, I would say it encouraged me to keep writing the book more than anything, more than it influencing necessarily how the act in the book comes to life. Because like I said, I think it's, a federal program in reality would have to be so different from these other programs that have passed. But I looked at the I guess, the different ways that those have been structured to influence the act in the book.
Right. So, it's interesting that you talk about that you wrote this in one sitting,
Well,
and it's a
several
novel.
things, but
Well, not one sitting. I didn't mean to say one sitting.
yeah.
You wrote this straight. And you also had to move from writing primarily nonfiction to writing fiction. What was that process like? And as you were writing this, without really getting that interference from other sources, how do
Mhm,
you think that helped to shape the way you structured the novel? Because you center it around a young woman. The,
mhm,
the novel is more than about reparations, it's about some other things.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it was very different than writing nonfiction, where nonfiction you have a hypothesis that you're working toward and you have sources and it's very obviously fact-based. Whereas the book, there's so much freedom, which was both good and bad. Um, and, I think I sort of approached it in many ways like I approached my nonfiction work, which is that I knew that I wanted to have characters that readers could fall in love with. I also knew that I have my own biases, right? That I am in favor of a reparations program. And so, how do I work that into the book in such a way where it doesn't feel didactic, but feels authentic to what I wanted to communicate? So, I think my nonfiction work helped me in that way, in terms of knowing that here's this thing that I'm exploring. How do I get to the end result? Um, and then the freedom came from exploring the characters and how they would react to it. And that sort of brought me out of my own hypothesis, so to speak. And instead, it was viewing everything and viewing the reality of this world through the characters.
Right. And you start with the older man having
Marcus,
this
yeah.
now. It was really so moving. And I felt like that's something so many people could relate to, because you probably have people who are trying to save their homes, save their land. So as I said, this is so much more than about reparations, but it's about how people have survived,
Mhm.
generations, how people have survived, moving from the South, the Jim Crow,
Yep.
the lynchings, the racism, even when they get to other countries. What was that like? I mean, other parts of this country. What was that like? Uh, Maybe a different question is, why were you motivated to center this around a family, one particular family? And I always think about novels, particularly first novels, as being autobiographical.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my motivation for working on the Atlantic piece was to understand my family's relationship to money and to wealth. And my experience in the country is very much through the eyes of a, privileged but upper middle class Black experience. And so I very early on knew that my relationship to money and my family's relationship to money was very different than my white peers' relationship to money. And so I think a lot of my writing has been centered around understanding that. And that I think that's, primarily was my motivation in centering it around this family, and also just trying to break through those stereotypes of traditional reparation stories where you hear um, it's lower income and then that relationship to reparations. And I wanted to view it through the eyes of a Black middle class family and what reparations means to them, and have it be, about money, but also more than money. And so, yeah, I mean, I think when I was coming up with the book, it was always going to be about a family. It was never just going to be about this policy and these sort of disparate stories. I always wanted it to be primarily about a family and then this act happening in the background and how they relate to it. I also think if, if an act were to pass, that would that would be what happens. It wouldn't be as though your life stops and then everything is focused on reparations. And so I tried to mirror that experience in the book, which is that like their life is going on and then this thing is happening that some of them have wanted, others are more skeptical of it. So I tried to sort of mirror that real world experience. And I was writing it, during the pandemic, and I came up with it before then, obviously, but a lot of, the experience of people applying for the PPP loan. My grandfather owns a construction company. My mom was in the process of
Okay.
applying for the PPP loan, right? And so there's suddenly this like large sum of money that isn't like the Forgiveness Act, but isn't too far off in the sense that the country on a federal level is giving out money to large groups of people. Um, and so it almost made it a little bit easier to write because we were I was going through that. The country was going through that as I was writing it. So
Well, so in addition to those autobiographical elements and what was happening in your experience,
mhm,
I think that writers are always in conversation with other writers,
mhm,
and that's across the genres. That's nonfiction and fiction. You enter this world where people are talking to each other about substantive issues,
mhm,
and that happens in books and in plays,
mhm.
and in film. So, who would you say you are in conversation with as a writer?
Definitely Toni Morrison. I think Paul Beatty, I we've talked about this previously, but I wanted to try and write a book about reparations that wasn't satire. But I think the books that do deal with reparations in satire, definitely I'm in conversation with them and they have moved the conversation forward in a different way. Um, and I just wanted to explore the flip side of that to see, okay, well, what if we dealt with it in a way that wasn't satire? What does that mean? How does it come to life? Um, I think Colson Whitehead in some respects. Um, yeah, those are the ones that are top of mind, but many more. But I think, they I was so influenced by their writing um before I started writing this book.
Right. So just following up on that. So some of the one of the what you see happening in the novel is these themes are occurring, the tensions between blacks and whites, between those who are in the African diaspora, different groups. That's the tension. And then on the other hand, I think what was really heartwarming to me was that search, going through the archives
Hmm.
and visiting the South. What would you why don't you reflect on that? What that process was like, and how do you imagine these conflicts would be if this were to happen on September the 10th, 2024? We're in a very difficult time here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I write in the either the author's note or the acknowledgments how spiritual that journey was for me because I had never been to Mississippi before. And I met with the employees at the archive department, the Mississippi Department of Archives and the Natchez Historic Foundation, and they were just incredible. And their ability to, first of all, deal with my character as if she were a real person was just very humbling. And it was very emotional for me because, this was my first act of fiction. And for them to sort of hear what this character is going through and say, okay, well, these are the documents she might find. It was just very, I guess, encouraging, right? To um, have them deal with the character in such a generous way. And then Yeah, I think just being in the South and everyone being so open and being able to talk about race in a way that's very different from how people on the East Coast talk about race was, enlightening, I think, for me. And um, I write in the book, how Willie feels at home going there in a way that she almost doesn't feel in Philadelphia. And just there's sort of like this, I guess, awakening that she feels going to the South and just being able to know that her family and ancestors are from there, even though she can't put a name to it and doesn't know exactly where they're from. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, my ancestors are not from Mississippi that I know of. Um, but it felt very, I think, it felt very almost like a homegoing in some ways to just be in the South and be around people who are open to talking about slavery in a different way than on the East Coast.
Right. We're in a different time now because I understand that feeling of going to the South. You know, growing up, I never wanted to be near the South. I was so
Right.
fearful of what could happen. But there's so much rich history in the South. And you think about those, there were those who chose to stay,
Mm,
those who migrated and those who chose to stay. And what were they dealing with when they chose to stay and what were they holding on to? And I think it's given me a different um, I would say a different type of respect, another
mm,
type of respect for those who chose to stay and to hold on to their culture.
mhm.
To say, I am going to, as Sonia Sanchez would say, I will resist, resist, resist.
Right,
I am not giving up. I am holding on to my land. I'm holding on to my home. And I'm
right.
going to make a place for my family. And I'm going to do what it takes to do that. Yeah. So you are someone who, huh?
Sorry, my dog is barking. That's why I
Okay.
muted.
Okay. So you are someone who also likes to take risks, obviously, because in 2024, you decided to open up a bookstore. Although I was reading recently that more and more independent bookstores are opening. Why did you choose to open a bookstore at this time? And what is your vision for the bookstore?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, Liz's Book Bar.
yes. Why did I choose to open at this time? I think because for me, third spaces are places where you can go that aren't work or aren't home to connect with other people is really important and to connect with strangers. And I think something beautiful happens when strangers are connecting with one another. And part of why I wanted to make it a bookstore, but also a cafe and wine bar is because that shared space where people are encouraged to stay, I think opens a dialogue and being around books opens a dialogue. And so um for me it was really about, and it's named after my grandmother, and she, I learned from her just how powerful it is to connect with strangers, and she was always welcoming people into our home and offering food, offering coffee. um and yeah, I think for me, it was just like I wanted to create a place built around books, built around creativity that encourages people to connect with one another. Um, and I grew up going to bookstores with her. So it felt very, it felt like the right way to do it.
Okay, so why don't you tell people how they can find the bookstore?
So we're at 315 Smith Street in Brooklyn. They can go to liz'sbookbar.com as well. And then we're also on Instagram at Liz's Book Bar. But yes, please come visit us in person and check us out. But we also ship books as well, so they could order online.
Okay, thank you. So because you are in the book business now, you are dealing with publishers and selecting which books to put in your store. How would you characterize that? And what are the the highlights and what are the challenges that you're having? What can you say about the book business and the publishing business, because you're face to face with it now?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's always a balance between stocking the books that people want, that people sell, that will sell, that are popular, with the books that I love or my staff loves that might be not as well known. And so I think, we're finding that right balance. It's is hard because, in publishing, a lot of the marketing dollars it will go toward established authors. And I think to get to that point, it takes time and it takes somebody at the publishing house being willing to champion that writer. Um, and so independent bookstores can only do so much. I think the publishers really have to choose who are they going to support in that given year. And there's only a few books that they really put a lot of
Right.
marketing dollars behind. Um, so yeah, I mean, we do what we can to really promote the books that we love. And that is important. I think, we continue to sell out of books that we hand sell because we really love them. And so I think that that will continue to be the case. And hopefully publishers will see the books that continue to sell based on what people really love. So
Right. There's nothing like that personal discussion that you can have with particular buyers.
right,
I had an opportunity to manage a bookstore, as I shared with you, and that was, that's the niche. That's something you don't get in a major bookstore. And of course, going online is nothing like feeling the book and
right,
touching it.
right.
So I wanted to get your views also on the need to have conferences and writers. We also host the National Black Writers Conference. And some people would say that there are so many writers, there are a number of writers who've been integrated into the mainstream. Like, why do you need to have a National Black Writers Conference? Why is there a need for one?
Well, I think I think it serves its own purpose that um doesn't exist elsewhere, which is to support one another, and also create visibility for the authors who aren't getting the support behind them that other writers are. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important just for community and also visibility, right? But
Right. Yeah, I want to, as we come to a close, I want to come back to some of the other themes that are in your book. I found very relatable the whole theme of what it means to be the other
mhm.
in a space when you're the only Black person in a space, and the whole concept around literary salons, or not, I call them literary salons, but salons where people were bringing different leaders in the community, different people together to talk. That's something that we don't do enough of.
Mhm.
And I imagine that's what you're doing in your space. But going back to that tension of being the other, when you have this climate where we have book bans and censorship, how do you think, or do you think that that helps people to understand what we really are facing? Because I don't know if everyone really gets it.
Yeah, yes and no. There's a lot, sometimes it feels like we're preaching to the choir a little bit. It's like the people we're reaching already know and understand.
Mhm.
Um, but like I said, I do think it's really important to bring people together so that we're talking to each other instead of reading it on our phones. I think there's a lot of just power and emotional and spiritual connection that happens when we're having face-to-face conversations. So that's part of, why I wanted to start the store is just to get people together instead of
Right.
everyone is so like siloed in their own worlds and on their screens, and it's really nice to just see people in the space connecting with each other, strangers talking to one another. I think, I don't know, I think there's a lot of people who are craving that connection.
So the whole concept of othering and being the other, is that something that even in your privileged
Yeah.
background that you've experienced?
Oh
Or
yeah, I
you
mean,
really
a
did?
lot of Paloma's experience in the book comes from my experience of being in mostly white spaces academically, even in corporate jobs. And I wrote about this a little bit in the Atlantic piece, which is that sometimes it felt or feels as though, as a Black person, once you get a certain amount of money, you sort of become like even more othered. Like you're like in these whiter and whiter spaces. Um, as you sort of move financially. Um, so a lot of my writing has tried to explore that experience of, you know, wanting to connect with your community or the Black community, but then also existing in these white spaces.
Right. Ongoing tension.
Yes.
What message do you have for students and for emerging writers who are moving into fiction or who just want to do nonfiction journalism as you've done? What message can you give them about writing?
Geez. I guess I would say, write the stories that feel true to you, that feel urgent, regardless of what someone tells you will sell or what or what is the topic of the moment. Just write the stories that feel urgent and necessary to you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you and hearing your views and your motivation. And I want you to again let readers, our listening audience, know how they can get acts of forgiveness.
Well, they can get it at Liz's Book Bar. We have plenty in stock. We are in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn at 315 Smith Street, or they can go to liz'sbookbar.com.
Okay. Thank you so much. And looking forward to your next project. But I know the immediate project is the bookstore.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. So you've been listening to my conversation with Maura, the author of Acts of Forgiveness, Maura Cheeks. And please support her. Support her by purchasing Acts of Forgiveness. Support her by visiting her bookstore online or going in person to visit that sacred space, the bookstore, or that community space. Okay, and it's a wonderful book. We read it in our book club. People loved it, and I wish you well. Please write me at writers@mec.cuny.edu and come back next week. Thank you so much, Maura. And you've been listening to Writers on Writing. This radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers Collins.